like to take the opportunity to say a little bit about participatory learning and how we think about learning as well, because I know it's always hard to convey that in an RFP, and I'm sure that some of you were looking at the application and thinking, what do they actually mean by participatory learning, and how do I write this proposal, and what is this digital media learning thing? So let me just say a couple of things in response to the question. One is that we were very intentional about naming this digital media and learning and not digital media and education or digital media and learning and education. We believe that education is what schools do, and that it's very institutional based, and we believe that learning is what everybody does, and everybody does everywhere, anytime, which they've always done across the centuries, but now can do it more easily because of the new media. And so for us, it's really about understanding learning across multiple contexts. The other thing that I'll say about, and this is one of at the core of the Digital Media and Learning Initiative, is also beginning to understand what are the important paradigmatic shifts that need to happen as we begin to rethink both what education and learning ought to look like and how we ought to support it. And so the participatory comes from really understanding from the research we've been doing that we have to shift from an understanding of learning as something that is consumption-based, that is a transfer from an expert to a novice, and the novice needs to consume what the expert knows, to something that happens through participation. And that it's through doing, through activity, through participating, through producing, through engagement in much of the Web 2.0 ways that learning really happens. So that's why the notion of participatory learning is so important to us. We're also, what's coming out of the research as we think about the disciplines and as we think about content, which is part of the core of your question, and I think is going to be an enormous challenge for the federal government as they want to have yet another conversation about standards, is that what we're learning in terms of from the kids about how they learn, and my PhD is in education, I am an educator. This was very hard for me to grasp, but that content, which in education is the outcome, right? We measure and test what kids know. That's the content that they know. In learning, content is actually the context of learning. It's not the outcome. And so part of what we're seeing from young kids is that as they're playing games and as they're in social networks, the content is something that they're interested in, but what they're doing is participating and making and producing and writing articles and doing a bunch of different things, and the content is just something that is the context through which they're getting to do a whole bunch of other activities. And that's a very different way of thinking about the disciplines and thinking about content. And so that's one of the things I'd like to challenge you all to think about during the course of the next year, because we're just beginning to grapple with what this means for how you design learning environments and how you engage young people. That said, then how do we think about skills and how do we think about assessment? And so we've been doing a lot of work. Katie Salen in the new school she's opening up in New York, and you're all invited to engage with Katie and to see the schools it opens up. Jim G. at Arizona State University has brought together some 10 of the best assessment folks in the country to think about this. Nicole Pinkert here in Chicago is doing some extraordinary work on assessment. But assessment has to also be embedded in the context of content as kids are doing things. And so we're thinking about how do you measure creativity, and how do you think about collaboration as skills? How do you think about transmedia navigation, right? Kids are navigating across a bunch of different media contexts. How do you think about judgment? I mean, it's absolutely critical. Kids are overwhelmed with information right now, but what matters is the decisions they make and their judgment. So we have a guy, Dan Schwartz at Stanford University, who's on the assessment team, who really thinks that it's the decision points kids are making we should be assessing. Not anything that they produce at the end, but how are they making their decisions through this participatory process? That tells us a lot more about what they're going to do in another context than actually anything we get from standardized assessments. So part of the question is, and we're in conversation with lots of folks in the Department of Ed, as well as, are we assessing even the right things, right? If we're really concerned about our kids' success in the 21st century, and are we placing them in the kinds of learning environments that are going to allow them to develop the kinds of dispositions and habits of mind and skills that they're going to need for the 21st century? So that's the part of the conversation that I want to invite you all into over the next year as we keep grappling with what the future of learning ought to look like.
Thank you, Connie.